When you say technology these days, everyone thinks of the hyper-leftist bubble of Silicon Valley. Except there is more to technology than that. Besides, Silicon Valley is in itself a product of conservative thinking. It is essentially a special economic zone where most rules don't apply. Lower taxes, lower regulations, and more economic freedom. Most of the things in Silicon Valley would not fly anywhere else in California, something which Silicon Valley kids learn really fast once they leave the place with their first million or billion. But it's not about Silicon Valley that I want to talk about today, but about a conservative approach to technology. Liberals and leftists are surprised to learn these days that a huge chunk of young non-leftists are youngsters from the STEM fields, particularly the T and E parts of the STEM, that would be technology and engineering. And this is particularly true in the neo-reactionary circles where there are more techies than in some tech conferences. But this is hardly a surprise. Any person involved in technology has to approach things, well, conservatively. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Oh boy, this is a video which will not gain me new friends for sure. But then again, if I want friends, I don't look for them on YouTube. Alright, so two things I want to address in this video, and they're kinda interconnected. One is techno-optimism and two is the conservative use of technology. Now, techno-optimism, as practiced by tech companies, is the idea that everything is possible, including what is not possible. A good example of such thing is the company of the biggest welfare whore around, Mr. Elon Musk. Tesla recently made an astonishing announcement in a blog post titled "All Tesla cars being produced now have full self-driving hardware." Now, as it turns out, that's utter nonsense. The cars won't be able to drive themselves. They are in fact cars that are sold to customers who will implicitly, mostly without consent, be included in a guinea pig study. Basically, the customers will be feeding lots and lots of data to Tesla, which then Tesla hopes will be able to use to create the software for the alleged self-driving hardware. And they hope to do that by the end of 2017, which, coming from a company that routinely misses its deadlines by quite a wide margin, means exactly nothing. That's techno-optimism. Now, techno-optimism for the consumers is basically believing all the hype and the endless stream of nonsense that technology salesmen feed the public with. I alluded to this in one of my older videos addressing the claim that work will be abolished by technology, which you can watch here. Now, Tesla cars fanboys genuinely believe that self-driving cars will replace normal cars by the end of this decade and that self-driving trucks will be the norm by 2030. Now, that's techno-optimism, though I would have another word for it: utter delusion. Now, techno-optimism wouldn't be that bad if confined to inventors, innovators, and generally inside companies and organizations that deal with cutting-edge technology. In fact, a certain dose of techno-optimism is needed, but in those areas. But when techno-optimism becomes generalized, that's a recipe for disaster. And disaster will it be, since we are now in a giant tech bubble that will burst eventually. Now, if I am to trust Silicon Valley investors, it will happen roughly 12 months from now. If I am to trust Bloomberg, it could happen anywhere between 6 months from now and early 2018. Either way, it will happen unless the techno-optimism is tempered. In other words, unless the actors, that would be the users, the investors, and innovators alike, start acting more conservatively. particularly the users and investors, since they have the biggest incentives to do so. And the investors have started to do just that, although they still think this is just a minor market correction. The smart ones know better and put a brake on the whole VCing thingy, at least for the time being. Now, to give you another example of why generalized techno-optimism is dangerous, meet Theranos Incorporated, a US tech company that released a piece of blood analysis technology marketed as fast, easy, and the highest level of quality, allegedly testing for hundreds of diseases and conditions. Now, it's just one problem. It doesn't work, like at all. And it has never worked. But everyone is slowly coming to terms with this reality only now, after users started suing the company after they suffered heart attacks days after the magic technology told them they're perfectly fine, which in fact they were not. And this isn't just one users, but many, at least in the tens of thousands tier, at least what we know thus far. My personal bet is that it's in the hundreds of thousands, bordering a million. Now, how could this happen? Well, because investors quite literally wanted to believe that the technology can work. And I'm not joking. One of the investors put in over $500 million into the firm over several years, even though he was made aware of the faults of the technology when he had only powered less than $1 million into this thing. That's what techno-optimism does. It loses investors' money, it promotes unsound and bullshit business, and sometimes it kills people. Now, admittedly, Theranos is a highly extreme example of techno-optimism. Most examples of techno-optimism don't involve actual harm of people, but still do involve massive amount of capital wasted on, quite literally, nothing. In 2014, for example, there was a startup that made an app that said, "Yo!" No, that's it. That's all the app was doing. And it got $1 million investment to say, "Yo." Now, the creator didn't take the app seriously. He made it in a day as an April Fool's joke. But the techno-optimist investors did. Since then, the app has been updated, that it now basically tweets "yo" in the sense that it transmits a user's location. You can also put a link to the "yo", attached a photo, and have friends that you put in a group so you can "yo" at more people at once. And then it was hacked, leading to quite a lot of sensitive and private data being sold on the open market. So not only it is useless crap, but dangerous useless crap too. $1 million well spent. And there are tons of examples like this one that if anyone had evaluated them, well, conservatively, they would have never existed, and far less capital would have been wasted on, quite literally, nothing. Now, in a genuine free market, this would matter a lot less. They would simply be examples of silliness, and that's pretty much it. But we're not in a free market, so these things create much more damage than they would have otherwise did. Theranos would have harmed fewer people if there wouldn't be such a vast, overreaching regulatory apparatus that not only makes innovation hard, but also makes exposing the flaws also very hard. It took years to get the government to admit its mistake and start cutting down on the licenses of Theranos. In an actual free market, things would have been corrected much faster. Uber is another example of a relatively meaningless startup. Now, sure, Uber is successful, but Uber is successful for one sole reason: because big government exists. Without city halls and local governments supporting the monopoly of the taxis, Uber would have had no reason to exist, because competition would have already reached lower taxi fares by now. But because we're not in a free market, we have astonishing anomalies, such as Uber being the largest car company, bigger than General Motors, without manufacturing or owning any cars. Now, mind you, I don't mind Uber existing. In fact, from a political perspective, or a practical politics perspective, Uber is very useful because it is an example that can force young millennial leftists to think about why a freer market is simply better. But I am saying that there are trade-offs that need to be considered, and they currently aren't, and that's at least in part because of techno-optimism. And that's how we slide into the second part, the conservative approach to technology. Now look, I personally came to the right of politics very naturally, because the right of politics is to be merely an extension to what I already think and do when dealing with technology. Now, everyone has his or her own reasons for reaching a political position, but I still do cringe when I speak to fellow conservatives and libertarians who don't apply their philosophy in places where they could make a difference right away. So basically, applying conservatism to technology is just like applying conservatism to life. For instance, non-leftists know instinctively that being promiscuous is something that is not particularly good for you. It doesn't mean that it should be illegal, but it does mean that one should strive not to do it just because it creates pleasure. The long-term consequences aren't worth it. Now, the same judgment applies to technology. Following the latest tech hype might create immediate pleasure, and I mean that literally. Dopamine levels go sky high when we buy new shit. So following the latest tech hype does that, but that doesn't mean it is a good idea. The long-term consequences aren't worth it. That's why I don't have a smartphone, for instance, nor will I ever have one. Sure, it's convenient and creates some levels of pleasure, but the trade-off is huge and, conservatively speaking, completely unacceptable. For starters, any conservative worth his salt should be concerned about surveillance, particularly state surveillance. Well, carrying a supercomputer with you with all your private data in your pocket, always connected to the internet, and most of the times with Bluetooth opened as well, is the best way to make sure you can be tracked at all times. Now, that's a tremendous asset in big cities where it is harder in some ways to track people. Smartphones have made that very easy. Now, with this kind of phone, like this one, surveillance is suddenly a lot harder. For starters, if it is shut down, like it is this one, it's useless from a surveillance perspective. If it's open, you can triangulate its location, but with a low degree of accuracy. And in a big city, that's a huge blow for whomever tries it, because a 2-kilometer range means a lot of buildings and people. Now, this thing does not have an internet connection, doesn't support any type of data other than SMS, cannot be connected easily to a computer, and its microphone cannot be remotely converted into a listening device, as it is the case with literally all of those smartphones. Now, a decent trade-off would be to carry a shut-down smartphone to use only when necessary. Now, I've seen some people doing that, and I suppose that's a decent measure, but I wouldn't trust that either. And I've been to countries where I don't speak the local language and still was able to find things without letting the almighty Google, and by proxy Prism, know what I'm looking for and where I am. Last time I was in Hungary, I even outpaced a friend of mine with his fancy phone. He spent 10 minutes just getting his phone switched back to his language because it had all switched to Hungarian by itself. Meanwhile, I just read the signs and followed my instinct. Beat him by 25 minutes in locating the place we were supposed to get to. The idea that smartphones are useful simply doesn't resonate with me at all. Anyway, I don't want to turn this into an anti-smartphone rant, but I do want to stress that buying into the techno-optimistic assumptions is not necessarily a good thing. Now, sure, not all new pieces of technology are bad, but some are, and the conservative approach to them usually pays dividends in terms of personal privacy and liberty. Now, the worst thing one can do is do internet banking on a smartphone. Now, I was laughing the other day when I saw the bank's annual whining that Romanian youngsters don't use internet banking, even though most of them do have a smartphone that they use regularly. Well, that's because youngsters aren't idiots. It's also interesting to note that those who work in IT are the most reluctant to tie their shekels with the grid. And for a bloody good reason, because they tend to know best how these things work. Now here's a reality check. Most banks, especially the big ones, suck big time at cybersecurity. I mean, Windows XP, yes, Windows XP, still runs on most of the ATM machines around the world. At least 2/3 of them by some estimates. And it works the same in small banks and big banks. I mean, Citibank, HSBC, RBS, you name it. They all use Windows XP. To make things worse, many banks still use Windows XP in general for their daily operations, including for supplying internet banking to its users. Now, should I mention that over a quarter of desktops around the world still use Windows XP? Now you tell me, which message is safer to the public? Avoid using internet banking if you can and rely as little as possible on electronic payments, which is my message, or the mainstream message, which is literally peer pressure to get on with the program and integrate into the Borg and surrender your most intimate data to companies who do a terrible job at securing that data to begin with. I dare to argue that my message is much more protective of the individual's interests. Again, I'm not saying don't use electronic payments at all. I mean, heck, this channel is supported through such means. But I am saying that in the overwhelming majority of cases, cash is simply king. And this is another principle that should guide the conservative approach to technology. View technology as a tool. Now, way too many people quite literally embed themselves into technology, and that is not healthy. Just like being a Luddite isn't healthy either. What I am advocating is the good old conservative principle of prudence, or as my father likes to say, think 5 seconds before doing or saying something. This absolutely applies to purchasing new technology. Now, lefties whine that the cost of living has gone up, but in reality, it really hasn't. It's the expectations that have gone up way more than their standard of living can afford. Food is cheaper than ever, transportation is cheaper and faster than ever, communication is cheaper than ever, energy is cheaper. Actually, everything except housing and healthcare are cheaper. And housing is more expensive, at least in part, because of left-wing policies. And healthcare is more expensive in part because of government interference, and in part because your shekels buy different things. I mean, after all, the healthcare of 2016 is not the same as the one in the 1970s. It's bigger, better, faster, and yes, as a result, more expensive. Now, one of the reasons many individuals are inclined to think the cost of living has gone up is because individuals are no longer behaving conservatively with their finances. In the not-so-distant past, people would buy a new phone once in, let's say, 5 years, sometimes even rarer than that. Today, buying a new phone once in 2 years is promoted as the norm, even though it's not really the case, but don't let the techno-optimists know that because they'll call you a Luddite. And to make things worse, phones are more expensive because you buy smartphones that not only make you less free and less private, but also poorer. I've met a poor girl in England who contracted a loan so she can get the latest iPhone. She thought I was from a different planet when I simply asked, "Why would you do that?" Now, the same argument goes with other items, such as computers, especially laptops. This is in spite of the fact that a laptop made in, let's say, 2009, for instance, can be repurposed with minimal expenses, less than 70 euros really, to compete very well with one made in 2016 of similar category. In the past, people used to seek for a specialist to do this so they can save up on expensive. Not anymore, and that's bad. Again, I'm not saying one should go back and use an ENIAC or a Pentium Pro, but a G series or an EEPC series from a laptop from, let's say, Asus, and that's from 2009, can very reasonably do all the tasks you need in 2016 and do that quite flawlessly. Same goes with cars. Now, admittedly, this is partly the government's fault, at least here in Europe, with all the eco-Marxist legislation effectively compelling poor people to give away their old cars and then subsidize through their taxes the middle class to buy new, eco-friendly cars. Because that's exactly what this scheme is doing. Poor people lose out quite a lot on this one. Not so in America, where 40-year-old cars still run strong to this day, thus enabling poor people to have a shot at getting out of poverty. Anyway, the point is that one should think multiple times before buying and adopting a new piece of technology. Sometimes, and quite often actually, what's new is not necessarily good. Now, sometimes the conservative approach, namely that what has passed the test of time is good, simply does pay dividends. And this is the third and final point in conservative approach to technology. Avoid the hype and techno-optimism, especially as an investor and as a consumer. Now, governments should also take notes on this one, because, for instance, I cringe at every moment when I think that the Trump versus Hillary race is decided through electronic voting. Now, that's a horrible idea per se, and subjected to massive dangers that simply do not exist in places where prudence prevailed and good old paper was kept. Technology is a tool, and as any tools, it has good uses, bad uses, and debatable uses. Now, avoiding both the bad and the debatable uses is probably the best way, and incidentally, the conservative way to approach technology. Every time technology seems to attempt to change something, one should always ask, what is the trade-off? Sometimes the trade-off is worth it. For instance, digital relays cut back quite a lot of jobs from the telecom industry, but we are all better off for it. But sometimes the trade-off is not worth it, like the massive adoption of 24/7 internet-connected phones that enabled the rise of the super surveillance state to levels that nobody could even begin to imagine merely 2 decades ago. Anyway, I've pissed off enough people for one video, so I guess I'll stop here. With that said, thank you for watching, and please do direct all the hate below. Talk to you all soon.